With the change in the UK generation portfolio, there is a massive challenge to make sure that the security of supply is protected. If it's a sunny day and it's windy, then there's not really an issue with the generation portfolio. If the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, then we end up with a real squeeze on our ability to be able to generate enough power for the country's requirements. This site's made up of 2 megawatt engines, and when the call from grid comes for these engines to work and to generate, they have to be up and on the bars within 5 minutes.
The grid was designed and built in the 50s and the 60s, and it was only ever really designed to effectively provide electricity to the user. It was never designed for electricity to be generated and put back onto the grid. So the electrical network in the United Kingdom needs to become a lot smarter.
A lot of the big construction for power generation was sort of in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and those sort of plants are coming to the end of their lifetime.
We're very interested in investing this technology. By 2030 we'll have 30 gigawatts of wind. With that 30 gigawatts of wind, we're going to need a lot of energy storage, and we're also going to need a lot of fast response power.
If you look at a nuclear replacement, you're looking at least a 20-year build cycle to get a nuclear sort of up and running as well. So big regional power stations, as was the old model, isn't really going to be achievable in the short term.
The Paris Agreement is in force now, which basically means there's a central treaty, and then every country in the world has put on their INDIC, their intended nationally determined contribution. And this basically says for every country in the world, their targets to contribute to a world where we're reducing the amount of emissions to keep temperatures below 2 degrees of pre-industrial times.
You're seeing coal being phased out because of the emission issues with burning coal, particularly around sulphur, and these have been replaced sort of early to sort of 2000s. It started with a lot of wind being put in, a lot of offshore wind, a lot of solar.
Basically, you'll get to a stage quite often going forward where we've taken 10 gigawatts of coal offline, where there's no wind, there's no solar, there's big demand, and these gas peaking engines have to ratchet up.
If there's 30 gig of wind, then you'll need 10 gig or a third, roughly, of an alternative power source, whether that's battery or whether that's gas reciprocating engines.
40% reduction versus 1990 by 2030. No offsets used. This is a very, very big ask. So this is all what we're talking about, is changing the mix of fossil fuels to renewables, and more renewables, which chiefly will be wind and solar, which are intensely intermittent.
The capacity market was founded in around 2014, and it was created to serve a need to get power onto the bars quickly due to fluctuations mainly in renewable energy. Tempest Energy challenged the whole basis of the capacity market in the European courts, and they recently won I think it's about a 4-year court battle, and the capacity market was suspended. But there's going to have to be a capacity market replacement of some form. The reason that's of interest to all of us is because the need to generate power hasn't gone away.
Power on Demand Services is a company that we are potentially looking to finance, and they've brought in a group of developers, many of which we've met today. They seem very, very well resourced, and they got a huge amount of experience in this market to know how things really work, because as with everything, it may look simple on the outside, but when you get into the inner workings, it's fairly complex.
We're a relatively small organisation. Basically, we're headed up by a gentleman called Glyn Jones, who has worked in the electricity industry since he got out of short trousers, so there's very little he doesn't know about electricity generation. He's supported by myself, finance. I've worked in the industry for a number of years, worked with Glyn for close on 20 years, I think now, with Matthew Jones, who heads up our operational HR and support services. We've got a gentleman called Wayne Askey, who's the gas expert. I'm a finance man, I'm an accountant. I've been in the energy industry since 1994. I've worked for energy suppliers, I've worked for network operators, I've also worked for private organisations in consultancy and construction of energy related projects. and we've got access to a number of parties and partners that we've operated with over the years in terms of actually creating generation sites. This site was built by a company called Octocom, who we've partnered with on, I think it's probably 250 meg of generating sites. So again, we've got quite a network of partners that we bring in to be able to effectively apply the end-to-end solution, so all the way from design right the way through to construction. If we take an example size of 20 megawatts, to get fully consented, so that's planning permission, option on the land, gas connection, electrical connection, you're probably talking in the region of about £100,000 if you've got a site that can go effectively straight through. That doesn't account for the cost of all of the other sites that you've tried to get through what we call the funnel. I think success rate is probably about 1 in 20. A lot of people think they've got very good sites, but by the time you've looked at the cost of the connections, you've looked at issues in terms of noise and emissions, not many sites actually fit the bill. But if you've got a perfect site straight through, about 100k to actually get it fully consented. Construction costs, the major variable actually is the cost of your connections. You'd hope to get both your gas and electrical connection in for less than £2 million. Your actual site build on top, you're probably talking for a 20 megawatt site around the £10 million mark to actually build out.
So it's quite ambitious, but we're really having to take a view on how the electricity markets are going to look in the next 10 years.
All you're doing is trading effectively on the day ahead, the N2X market. Your IRR at the moment, with no capacity market revenues, no embedded benefits, nothing assumed for triads, you might be sort of in the 7, 8, 9% bracket. If you then start layering up a replacement for the capacity market, potentially some triad income, maybe some other contracts, you might start getting up towards the sort of 12, 13% mark. Private wire really does change the numbers significantly. What you're actually doing is if you can find an off-taker who's got a very good base load, maybe operating 24/7, you can actually provide them with electricity at a much cheaper price than they're paying to import it from the grid. If you look at what you pay for electricity, maybe 50% of what you're paying is not actually related to the wholesale electricity cost. 50% of it is the fixed charging of running the network. It even includes, for example, the supplier profits. So by purchasing off an embedded generator or a private wire, you're eliminating an element of those fixed costs. What it does for the investment, you're looking at IRRs in the region of 15 to 20% easily, and that is still after you've generated maybe a 15% saving on the electricity price for the end user. And we quite often see the reaction, it's too good to be true, but actually it is true for private wire users. It is cheaper to purchase from embedded generation than it is to purchase from the grid.
Pods, the company that we're working with and have done a fair amount of due diligence, are confident that they can aggregate around 500 megawatts. So that starts to be very, very attractive with high levels of debt in there to construct, to potentially pension funds where you can offer them a unlevered return of 6-7%, and that is manna from heaven.
What we are well placed to do is work with the DNOs, because we have inside knowledge of the distribution network operators. Glyn was the director of Midlands Electricity Board. I've worked for distribution network operators. We know how they work. So therefore, where their first answer might sometimes be no, we can go, yes, but have you considered this? Have you considered that?